Hi, I'm Adam and I'm the tech lead for the Wikidata and Wikibase teams, and I'm going to kick off this presentation on scaling the Wikidata query service. We'll have a quick introduction to the query service itself, covering what it is, what it does, and the scale that it operates at, before diving into the challenges the query service currently faces, short-term mitigations, and towards a long-term strategy. So what is the Wikidata query service and how did we get here? The Wikidata query service was developed during the early life of Wikidata and was deployed in 2015, making it roughly 6 years old right now. And it enables people to access Wikidata data and the graph made up of all of the connections within Wikidata using the Sparkle query language. The easiest way to get stuck into the query service is via the UI, which is deployed to query.wikidata.org. Here in the bottom corner of the slide, we see a query looking for Broadway venues that are also represented by this UI in a map. Internally, the graph is made up of triples, and you'll most commonly hear about triples in terms of subject, predicate, object. Applying that pattern to Wikidata data, we could have Q64, P31, Q5119. And in English terms, that's a triple that says Berlin is the instance of a capital city. And we can also see in this slide the graph coming out with more of these triples, such as saying Berlin is a partner city of Paris, and Paris is also a capital city. The Sparkle query in the corner of this slide would select all of the items that are an instance of capital city and show you these in a result. The Wikidata query service is one of the largest public Sparkle endpoints on the internet today, and it's powered by an engine called BlazeGraph that has quite a few modifications for the Wikidata query service use case. Generally speaking, update events are emitted from Wikidata. These result in triples that are loaded into BlazeGraph, and then all of this can be accessed via a Sparkle API. The public production service currently runs on 11 servers, with 5 or 6 of them serving traffic at any given time, allowing for failover in another data center as well. And currently the query service contains roughly 13 billion triples from 95 million Wikidata entities. This averages around about 140 triples per entity, but large entities can have tens of thousands of triples. Wikidata receives regular edit peaks of 700 edits per minute, or 12 a second, and this equates to something like 20,000 triple updates per minute, or 330 per second. And in terms of reads, the service currently peaks at around about 25 million requests per day, which is around 290 per second, with around about 15% of those hitting the edge caches. So in terms of a single server backend, this will be handling around 58 queries per second, as well as 330 triple updates in a graph of 13 billion triples. And now I'll hand over to Guillaume to look at the scaling challenges in more concrete terms.
Hello, my name is Guillaume. I'm the engineering manager for the search platform team at Wikimedia Foundation. My team is responsible for search, as the name implies, but also for Wikidata query service. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the scaling challenges we have on Wikidata query service at this time. Roughly, we can put our challenges in 4 different categories. First, we need to be able to keep up with the write load. Wikidata as a high edit project, we need to ingest all those edits on Wikidata query service. At time, we're already lagging behind in terms of keeping up with that write load. We also need to keep up with the query load. We're exposing a public Sparkle endpoint, which means we have no control over the load generated by our users. There are times where we get either a very large number of queries or a small number of very expensive queries. The system gets overloaded. That leads to high response time, and in the worst cases, complete timeout for all or a significant number of the queries that are running on the system. We also need to keep up with the data size itself. Our current solution for the backend of Wikidata query service is BlazeGraph. It has no sharding support or very limited sharding support, which means we need to have larger and larger disks and larger memory size, and we're limited by what we can find in a single server. We can buy larger and larger servers to a point. It becomes expensive and problematic. We're Also thinking that we have internal limitations in BlazeGraph. We've already reached some of those limitations. So far, we've always been able to find workarounds, improve configuration, find ways to fix those limitations. We suspect that we might at some point reach one of those limitations and just not know what to do with it. We also need to keep the system stable and secured. We already have systems, servers crashing regularly. That leads to limited capacity, and that capacity gets overloaded. BlazeGraph is no longer actively developed or maintained, which means any bug fix or problem that needs to be fixed is on our shoulder, and this is not something we really have the capacity, the know-how to support in the long term. Of course, all those changes are linked together. For example, keeping up with the write load is easier if there is no query load, and if the query load goes higher, then the write load becomes more problematic. All those things are interacting with each other, which is making them even harder to support. In the short term, we're thinking about how to mitigate those problems. We're talking about disaster mitigation, and that's about the short-term solution. And the short-term problem, the scenarios we're envisioning at this point are on one side, we're afraid we might max out on the data size at some point. That, for some limitation, hardware, software, we're not able to ingest any new data. That means from that point on, only historical data stays available. Anything that has been edited since then, we might not have the ability to update our graph database to reflect that. That would break most edit workflows. It would have like huge consequences on the use both of Wikidata Query Service, but also on Wikidata itself. The other catastrophic failure that we're imagining is a combination of query load, write load, and update lag. We might reach a point where we're just unable to keep up with the amount of updates. And that would mean we would start to lag more and more. So far, we've always been able to catch up, but there's probably a point where we would not be able, and Wikidata Query Service is going to catch up more and more, with again huge impacts on editing workflows and general use cases around both Wikidata Query Service and Wikidata. To get into a little bit more details on how we want to mitigate those scenarios, I'm going to let Mike continue the presentation.
Hi, I'm Mike, the PM for the WMF search team, and today I want to talk a little bit more about the disaster mitigation strategies we have given the catastrophic failure scenarios for WDQS. Our disaster mitigation goals are twofold. One is to prevent the total collapse of the query service, and two is to preserve a minimum level of functionality for its users. One thing I want to reiterate is that disaster mitigation is not the same thing as long-term goals. So we think of disaster mitigation as a playbook for how to keep WDQS alive in the event of an emergency, which is different than the ideal end state. So in some ways, I think of it as in a worst case scenario playbook, right? So like if you're on a plane and you have oxygen masks come down, this is kind of a protocol for an emergency, but not necessarily how you want to be flying all the time. That being said, some of the actions we take in disaster mitigation might inform how we want to do long-term scaling and might be applicable in the future. And we might learn things in the process of how we have to manage disaster for how we want to scale the service long-term. In planning for catastrophic failure, we've identified some steps. So the first step is to be more transparent with the community about the current state of WDQS and scaling and disasters. So that is, you might have seen some of the Wikidata mailing list announcements and some of the same announcements on Project Chat, as well as this presentation itself. The goal of this transparency, one, is so that the community is more familiar with disaster mitigation in general, and so that any actions that we have to take in these scenarios is not going to be a surprise. And secondly, the more the community knows about the current situation, the more you can also help us in formulating a solution for long-term scaling and even how to mitigate disaster in a way that is least impactful to you. As for the two failure cases, one, as mentioned before, is the BlazeGraph size scenario. In this step, we'll prioritize data in BlazeGraph to temporarily delete from BlazeGraph. And then in the other scenario in which we have to balance query load and update lag, we'll have to find and determine the acceptable compromise between the update lag and the query loads as well. And I'll speak to this in a little bit more detail. So in the scenario where BlazeGraph maxes out, we need to prioritize data in order to reclaim some of the space and give us a longer runway to scaling long term. And so to do this, we may have to temporarily delete or split data out from BlazeGraph. I want to reiterate that the data will still exist in Wikidata and dumps. It doesn't go away forever. The difference is we won't be loading it into BlazeGraph, and so it won't be in the graph itself, which unfortunately makes it unusable, but it won't be gone forever. And so at a future date, we can incorporate it back in or federate it or whatever the long-term solution will be. Currently, we are doing investigations on the shape of the Wikidata graph and the queries on that graph. And we think about how we can prioritize data in at least two different ways. So one way is we talk about vertical slicing, and we look at the items in the graph and they have descriptions, labels, etc. And what kind of things can we remove from items in order to reclaim space in the graph? So this might be things like external IDs or non-English labels. We don't really know yet what the right way of slicing it might be in terms of impact versus the benefits of it, but that is a strategy we're referring to as vertical slicing. The other strategy we are looking at is what we call horizontal slicing. So this is where we're looking at subgraphs of the larger graph, things that can be split off or removed from BlazeGraph in order to save space. So for example, some of the analysis that we've done shows that 50% of Wikidata triples are related or are scholarly article related. And that actually represents about 40% of the entities in the graph itself. At the same time, only about 2% of queries are hitting these scholarly article triples and entities. So here we can kind of see that there's a really high space to query ratio, right? Scholarly articles, in another way of putting it, they take up a lot of space in the graph and are only involved in a relatively small amount of queries. So this would be a subgraph that would be a candidate for removing. Other ones might be astronomical objects or lexemes. These also appear to be distinct subgraphs. More importantly, though, this kind of gives us a framework of thinking about cost-benefit analysis here, right? So in the case of scholarly articles, at the current rate of growth of Wikidata, if we were to remove them from the from the Wikidata graph, it would take about 3.5 years of time before the graph grew back to its current size. So when we look at other objects, or if there's other candidates for subgraphs that we might want to split out, this is the framework that we're looking at to how to evaluate the benefits and the costs in these disaster scenarios. In the short term, we would be deleting these subgraphs, but a more medium long-term strategy, if it makes sense, would be thinking about how to split the graph and once again, maybe federating it in or creating separate graphs altogether depending on the use cases. So next, I want to talk about query load versus update lag. So BlazeGraph has to balance the amount of queries it's getting with how quickly it can update. And as mentioned before, there is a scenario in which BlazeGraph can never catch up with the updates, or the query load gets too high. And so these are two things that are related and need to be balanced, but independently can also overwhelm the query service. One thing we're doing already is that we've released the new streaming updater to WDQS. And what this allows us to do is the number of edits per second has gone from about, on average, 10 edits per second up to roughly 88 edits per second. So we're seeing about a 9-fold increase in how many edits per second the streaming updater can, or Wikidata query service can handle. Other options that we're considering are we need to determine what the right compromise is for WDQS lag versus the updates, or max lag thresholds, max rate limit tolerance. Right now, we're trying to do everything as much as we can. It's unlikely that we can support unlimited performance in all of these dimensions. And so we'll have to work with the community, we'll have to work with you to figure out what the right compromise between all these different factors are. We also need to consider what if we might have to more aggressively rate limit bots. We already do this to some extent. We already rate limit bots to some extent, but depending on how much load that puts on the query service, this might be something that we have to do a little bit more aggressively if we reach the scenario where BlazeGraph is starting to fail catastrophically. So in summary, for disaster mitigation, I do want to reemphasize this is an emergency playbook for catastrophic failure scenarios. These are scenarios that nobody wants. This is functionality nobody wants. But the alternative is that the query service doesn't work at all. And so these are what we can try to do in the meantime to preserve some minimal level of functionality so that users can still use the query service, and give us a little bit of runway so that we can scale towards a lot more long-term solution and get functionality back to the level that everybody wants it at, or as close as possible. So to reiterate, what we're currently working on is how to prioritize graph data for deletion or splitting, and how to correctly or most optimally balance the query load and update lag. Both of these things are aspects and strategies we want to work with the community more and understand better your use cases and how to best preserve as much functionality as possible for you in these catastrophic failure scenarios, and how to mitigate this disaster in a way that preserves as much functionality for you as possible. So next, I want to talk about the user survey that many of you helped fill out. And this is starting to look a little bit more into the future towards a long-term strategy for scaling. So once again, the goal of this survey was to learn more about WDQS user priorities so that we can optimize our scaling strategy with your needs in mind. Currently, as of September 16th, we have 213 responses. So this is about a month of responses. So if we look at the demographic of users who filled out the survey first, most users are pretty interested in improving wiki projects. This is by far the majority. And then we see that is followed by academic and personal use of WDQS. Commercial data reuse is relatively low, and then there's a long tail of other uses that people filled out as well. We also see that most users use WDQS at least weekly or daily. It's about the same proportion, 40% for both, and we see about a fifth of users, about 20%, use it monthly or less. Next, we asked users to rank their priorities of 5 different factors in the order of least important, or their, in order of their highest priority down to their lowest priority. So we have data freshness, graph completeness, response latency, ease of use, and timeouts. So we can see, just eyeballing this, we haven't done any further deeper analysis, but just by eyeballing this, we can see that timeouts are the top priority for most users. So most users are concerned with their queries timing out. And we can also see that ease of use is the lowest priority. Graph completeness and data freshness are somewhere after timeouts, I believe. Graph completeness looks like maybe it's a little bit higher. And then somewhere in the middle, towards the bottom, we have response latency is a relatively low priority compared to the others. So we dug into these priorities a little bit further with optional follow-ups. So we asked about data freshness, and generally speaking, how quickly do users like Wikidata edits to be reflected in their WDQS results? About half of the users who responded wanted real-time data freshness, with about 30% wanted daily freshness was fine, and then it kind of drops off after that. This may be skewed when we think about this question independently from everything else, because all things being equal, like who doesn't want the freshest data? So I did expect everyone to say almost near real-time updates, but I think a lot of people were pretty honest about their needs, and we see that while 50% of people who responded wanted real-time freshness, we see a distribution that not everybody needs the freshest data when they're querying WDQS. Next, we asked a question about async results and how likely users would be to use a feature that allowed them to query, get their query results asynchronously. And most people said they would use this service. And I would say that the caveat is there's a hidden assumption here, I think, that async results would also allow for more lenient timeout restrictions. So I believe most people are saying that given a feature that let them get asynchronous results from their queries, but allowed longer timeout or no timeouts even, or just more lenient timeouts, then they would use this service. And then we also asked how satisfied users are with using Sparkle for WDQS. And it turns out most people self-report as being pretty satisfied with using Sparkle. Though I would say the caveat is that we also know most of the users who responded are daily or weekly users. And so if you're using WDQS on a daily or weekly basis, you're also probably more likely to be comfortable with Sparkle. So there may be some people who just don't know how to use Sparkle, or they don't find it easy, that are not represented here. But by and large, of the respondents, most people seem like they're pretty happy with Sparkle, relatively speaking. So just to summarize the survey results again, most users use WDQS at least once a week and are interested in improving wiki projects. Timeouts are by far the biggest priority, I would say, in respondents, and about half or more users want near real-time data freshness. And also most users report that they would use an async querying service. So the takeaways from all of this, one, we do kind of a rudimentary aggregation of what all these things mean together. I would say that the immediate takeaways are that users are likely to use async results if they think that this service would also allow them to fully run longer queries. And then also, because we can't do everything at once, the query service has to be optimized for certain things, then optimizing for timeouts may require sacrificing data freshness and or graph completeness if we cannot improve all of those things equally at the same time.
Mike now told you about some of the disaster mitigation plans, as well as showed you some preliminary results from the user survey. But where do we go from here long term? There are a number of steps we are taking. And the first and probably most important one is identifying and evaluating possible new backends for Wikidata Query Service besides Blazgraph. And the other area is about taking pressure off the system. So here, for example, we're looking at creating new additional services that can answer queries that maybe don't need the full power of Sparkle. So our work on the upcoming REST API, for example, is part of that. We are also going to make it easier to run your own query service so that the people who are heavily relying on the query service but maybe don't need to rely on the public endpoint can run their own service. And last but not least, we are making it easier to install and maintain Wikibase so that some of the data that's currently in Wikidata can maybe find a better home somewhere else. Now, to make all that a reality, we need your help. And there are a number of areas where you can help. First, you can provide us feedback on all the plans we just presented, either at the upcoming unconference session or on Wiki. Also, if you haven't already, it would be super useful if you filled out the Wikidata Query Service user survey so that we better understand how you're currently using the query service and what your priorities are, what's important to you. Then, another area where you can help is selecting the new query service backend. And here, especially helpful would be input on the criteria we use to select the new query service, and helping us with researching and trialing some of the potential new backends. And last but not least, you can provide input and ideas on other specialized additional new services that would be helpful to take pressure off the Wikidata query service. Thank you so much for your attention. We'd love to hear from you. You can get in touch with any one of us via these email addresses, or of course on the Wikidata mailing list. Thank you so much.